Hi there, it's Dr. Shiana Reams. Want to talk today a little bit about Alexander's use of myth. And this came out of some comments in my recent short little video, under 2 minutes, about the death of Hephaestion, ironically. And I was saying that no, we don't know when he died. I know he did not die in Alexander's arms. And please stop with this Achilles, Patroclus stuff. In that led to an interesting discussion in comments, not an unfriendly one at all. And I mentioned this term polycentral strategy of how Alexander approaches religious action, and also with that kind of how he also approaches myth. So it seemed like an interesting little discussion in several ways, both because Alexander's religiosity has never really been in question. One of the things that I think people have recognized from antiquity to today is that Alexander was deeply religious, in whether you want to attribute that to his mother, which I wouldn't just put it on Olympias's shoulders, that this is a function of that society. And I think the problem is that in a modern society where religion and myth and magic and all it's kind of kept a little bit at arm's length, especially in academia sometimes, that can feed into this dichotomy that is drawn between Philip and Alexander, that, Philip is pragmatic and he goes to war and he's not religious, and, he all of this stuff. That completely ignores the fact that Philip set himself up as the great defender of Apollo in the Sacred Wars, the Third Sacred Wars. That's like those are a disconnect. I do think Philip was maybe a little more pragmatic and a little less religiously interested than Alexander was. I don't think that's unfair, but I think that we have overdrawn this so-called dichotomy. And that, in fact, Philip was very interested in religion, was certainly able to use Apollo, and probably honestly felt some religious devotion, just like Alexander also uses religion, in addition to almost certainly feeling some genuine religious devotion to the gods. Things and actions can have multiple meanings, guys. They don't have to be one or the other. That's reductive. And in the ancient world, myth is ever present, much like in, say, 1800s, 18th century, 19th century, really 19th century America and early 20th century America, where there's constant references made back to the Bible. And of course, everybody recognizes these Bible verses and references, or you could even say, if we want to go in a slightly different direction, Shakespearean references as well. So myth was well known, and not just a few things, not just the popular gods and heroes like a Herakles or an Achilles or such, but people you and I don't regularly know anything about. They recognize this stuff because it's there all the time. Okay. So I don't want to divorce those two things. And I think that happens too much. And honestly, in scholarship, I am not alone. This is something that has been increasingly on the radar of scholars of religion, that these are false dichotomies that have been built in the past. I'm not saying that scholarship doesn't do this. Scholarship, in fact, does. We've been moving in this direction to greater recognition of this, greater recognition of lived religion. What does that mean? What does it mean to practice religion? Not just read the myths. What was it like to actually worship? I teach a whole class at UNO for grad students called Greek Lived Religion. And what does it look like? Okay. So coming back to Alexander, doing religious activities was constant. Okay. He had these things called tapatria, the family rites. So every morning, this man gets up and makes a sacrifice for the health of the Macedonian people, theoretically. We're told about this on his deathbed because, guys, this is the last thing he's doing. He can't do anything else, but he gets up and he makes these sacrifices. That's how important they were. And he's presumably doing this all along. I'm sure there were mornings it didn't happen, but that is part of being a Macedonian king. When you enter and exit cities, you make sacrifices. When you cross rivers, you make sacrifices. You make sacrifices before battle. You make sacrifices after battle. Even before dinner, when you're having a supper party, you give a little toast. In fact, let me borrow my little cup here. One of the things you do is you go out and you dedicate your symposium to the god of the day or the hero of the day, and you pour a little wine, and it could be wine, it could be oil, it could be a wide variety of honey, a wide variety of things. So obviously at a banquet it's probably going to be wine. So these are just part and parcel of daily life. Okay, so your life was hemmed around with all of these religious actions. Certainly if you're a king, because the king is the high priest for this kind of national cult. This is his job. This is what he's supposed to do. It's part of his religious charisma or royal charisma as a king. So why he's not a tyrant. I've talked about that in the video on Alexander as a tyrant, so you can go listen to me talk about it. Did Alexander think he was a god? I talk about it there too. Okay. So the world of the gods is very present all the time for Greeks, for Alexander. So is myth. As I said, they know this stuff like the back of their hand. And Alexander's constantly playing to this. Okay. Which then brings me to heroes in this whole notion of polycentral strategy, right? So this is not my idea. It comes from Rolf Vandenhoff, who writes about it in this little book, okay, The Legitimization of Conquest. Okay. Great book about monarchical representation and the art of government in the empire of Alexander the Great. I really liked this book. Lots of good stuff in here. And his article I highly recommend. And he kind of coins this idea of a polycentral strategy, and that this is how Alexander's approaching religion. Now, I've also gone on and done stuff on Alexander's religion myself, which appears in this, Brill's Companion to the Campaigns of Philip II and Alexander the Great. And in that, I discuss, in fact, how both Philip and Alexander utilized religion during their campaign, specifically more in a military context. But I've got a whole bunch of these tables that list all of the actions that they do, and I was very interested in pulling it apart by our sources. Once more, and I've said this many times, I think we are too inclined to try to take our sources and weave them together. And it's because we don't have a lot of information, and so it's very, very, very tempting to try to get little pieces from here and there and put it together to create what happened. Okay. And I think we need to pay more attention to how the sources present things. And certainly what I argue and discuss in that chapter is how our sources actually portray Alexander's religious actions and Philip's religious actions in different ways, and sometimes almost contradictory ways. So if you are reading Plutarch, and you may think that Alexander pays a lot of attention to dreams and oracles, and maybe not so much to omens and other things, except until you go look at Arrian and you go look at Diodorus. And if you read Diodorus, you'd assume he doesn't care about sanctuaries, but then you go read Arrian and there it is. Okay, so these are the various interests of our sources. And moving back and you look at, say, Philip, Diodorus shows Philip as this great defender of Apollo in the sanctuary there, the oracle at Delphi, with this third sacred war. But if you listen to Justin, Philip is impious. He's a terrible person. It's so that you get these clashing views sometimes in our sources. This is why I say you've got to look at them separately. Okay, sure. Sometimes you can put them together, but you're going to miss a lot. You're going to miss a lot. That brings me back to this polycentral strategy and looking at heroes and Alexander's use of myth. And this is, again, feeding into the whole idea of Alexander's the new Achilles. And it's really unclear, I think, how much of this concept of Alexander new Achilles is a later imposition by Roman authors. Okay? I would argue that Alexander certainly used Achilles. He sees himself as a descendant of Achilles on his mother's side. But as I've said elsewhere, that ain't the side that's getting him the Macedonian throne, right? On daddy's side, he's descended from Herakles. Guess who we see most often associated with Alexander in iconography, in other words, artwork? It's Herakles. I can't think of one image of Alexander portrayed as Achilles. Doesn't mean there weren't any. They haven't survived. Or if they have, it's not clear that's what it is. I can think of a lot, where Alexander's either using Herakles or he is Herakleized, or Herakles is Alexanderized, and they start to merge. Okay. Furthermore, this is consistent across time. We see this in various places. Sometimes it's bigger. He makes much more of a big deal of Herakles, for instance, when they reach the Aornos Rock in India, because in myth this was something that Herakles didn't take, and Alexander's gonna do it. And there's other places, especially at Tyre, where during the siege, where Herakles has disproportionate importance because he's associated with Melkart, the god of Tyre. So there are times when he pops more, but he's always there, and we do see him again in the iconography. Alexander himself is using, and we just don't see Achilles used that way. So going back to Achilles, where do we see Achilles at Troy when he crosses? And I said in the the video on Alexander's heroes, why this Achilles thing, Arrian makes a big deal about it. And Arrian makes a big deal about it because Arrian wants to be Alexander's Homer. Okay? So, of course, he builds that up. And there may be some other reasons for it as well. But that's a lot of it. He wants to be Homer, so of course he portrays Alexander more as an Achilles figure. And again, I'm not saying at all that Alexander's not using Achilles. I'm saying that that's not the central hero for him. Okay. So he talks about Achilles and utilizes Achilles when they're at Troy. Curtius only has this one surviving mention of Achilles, and is not a good one. At Gaza, when Alexander tied Battus, the leader of Gaza, behind his chariot and dragged him alive. Okay, we don't know if that actually happened, but Curtius is using it as a way of saying, yeah, he went a little far. Okay, so he's going to the rage of Achilles, not the good aspects of Achilles. Now, we are missing chapter 1 and 2 in Curtius, where I think we would probably have seen more appearance of Achilles. But even in Arrian, it's not just Achilles that Alexander's honoring when he's there. He's got a whole list, including some Trojans, like Priam. Okay. He makes sacrifices at the Athena of Troy. That's the temple. Okay. So, yeah, he visits the tomb of Achilles, which... obviously, Achilles is a fictional character, so it's not a real tomb. But this was part of the... He's doing the tour, guys. He's being a tourist. And he's walking around and doing all this stuff. And part of that is, of course, visiting this tomb of the guy he thinks is his ancestor. So that's part and parcel of it. And he certainly gives it a big deal. But he goes and does these other things, too. Okay. Walks off with this shield of Achilles, or is given the shield of Achilles. You never take something out of a sanctuary and just run away with it. It has to be given to you. There has to be stuff done for that. So you can't just walk in a sanctuary and rip something off the wall. Sorry, Netflix. But this is how it's part and parcel of the whole thing. Okay. So at Granikos, after Granikos, he sends a whole lot of things home to Greece. But then as time goes on, we don't see him sending back gifts to Greek sanctuaries. Whereas he does after Granikos, and this is, for the home front. I'm going to remind you of all the things I'm doing. But after Issus, he doesn't do that. Okay. He makes sacrifices. They're mentioned in detail, in fact, in Arrian. Buries the dead, but he doesn't send anything home. Now, arguably, maybe he's like sees Issus as unfinished business. I didn't catch Darius, so I'll send it back when I catch him. Except he continues to do that, and so from here on out, what we're going to see him do is make sacrifices at local temples, build up local shrines and temples, even to the point that whenever he is in Babylon, he gives money for the repair of Adamananke, the great ziggurat there in Babylon, and the temple of Bel Marduk, which had been damaged in the past. And so he gives money for this. And this is what he's doing. What is the story here? And as he goes down the coastline of Turkey, in each place he stops, and you'll see mention of this or that hero that is named, and he gives sacrifices to, or makes reference to, or ties. There's one family, or there's one city there that was supposedly, if I remember right, related to Argos, and of course the Macedonian royal house thinks that they are also descended from Argos and the Timonidae, and so he does special things for them because of this myth. Okay, for people we've never heard of before, but he knew it. Okay, so this is what I mean by he is paying attention to the local. He is tailoring his religious activity for the place he is. He's not referencing it back to Greece. He's not, sending things back to Delphi, sending things back to the Parthenon, or sending things back to Pella even. Occasionally he does, but Granicus is really the last time. And of course, that's the big battle. I showed I can beat up the Persians. Okay, so he keeps going. And each place he goes, he is very aware of what the local traditions are. So that's kind of what a polycentral strategy, religious strategy is instead of seeing a home base, the Greek version of the Vatican, or whatever you want to call it, and all focused on that. Instead, he's spreading the love around. And that also ties in then to how he is using mythology and heroes. So when he is in particular places, he is going to pay attention to the mythology that's important. Last example of this, when he gets to India, we start hearing a whole lot more about Dionysos. And Dionysus was an important central god in Macedonia, and an important god to his mother as well. But we don't really hear a whole lot about, he's not ignoring Dionysus, although he does blame Dionysus for the madness that made him kill Clitus, supposedly. But he's not doing a lot of sacrifices or references to Dionysus. And then he hits India, and all of a sudden Dionysus is important. Why? Because Dionysus went to India. Okay, so he's throughout, and here's something that we also need to understand that's different from, say, Christianity or other things, where most people in Christianity would say, well, I revere Jesus. I'm not trying to compete with him, except to try to follow in his footsteps. It would seem almost bad, disrespectful to try to outdo Jesus. Okay, that is not true of the Greeks. Okay, so Alexander both reveres Herakles and is constantly trying to outdo him. Same thing in India with Dionysus. He reveres Dionysus. He's a god, but I can outdo you. And so there's that tension going on as well, with their, particularly heroes more than gods. But even, you got to be a little careful with the gods. These guys are heroes, so I can kind of try to be equal to them at least, if not be better. So this is a good example of how he's thinking about his use of myth, and why we can't be too narrow in who he is including. And there's some heroes that are more important to him than others, and clearly one of those is Herakles. Dionysus is another. But Achilles is lower on the list. Some of the other gods get more mention than Achilles is. So don't emphasize this, recognize how Alexander is utilizing myth, and that it's often where is how Alexander is utilizing myth. So there's that polycentral strategy, religious strategy. And if you want to find out more about it, you can go read Ralph's article in that book, The Legitimization of Conquest. Okay? Thank you. And again, if you like all this stuff, subscribe to the channel, and you'll be notified of more.